Welcome back to today's Explainer. We've got a really fascinating one for you today. We're going to be tracing the historical and theological evolution of what it actually means to have a divine calling. We'll be taking a sweeping journey, looking at how the concept of being called by God evolved from these highly exclusive, isolated, ancient seers of antiquity, all the way to the universal empowerment of modern, everyday believers. It's essentially a story of democratization, taking something that was incredibly rare and distributing it to the masses.
Okay, let's dive right into this by starting with a deeply personal, ancient hook from the book of Jeremiah. It's a famous passage where God says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Now, think about how profound that actually was in the ancient world. This illustrates God's intimate foreknowledge of an individual before they're even born. It's the idea of the Creator forming someone, almost like a master potter meticulously molding clay, with a highly specific destiny already locked in prior to conception. It wasn't just about existing, right? It was about being engineered from the start with a highly specialized purpose.
And notice the specific phrasing there. The text explicitly says he was set apart. To be set apart means to be sanctified, consecrated, or dedicated to a specific use. Now, historically speaking, this kind of language was typically reserved for sacred, inanimate objects, things like the Sabbath day itself, the physical tabernacle, or the altars used for sacrifice. So applying this concept to a human being establishes our core theme for today. A divine calling is fundamentally about being consecrated for a specific, sacred purpose.
So, the crucial question we really need to ask right up front to frame our entire journey is, what does it actually mean to receive a calling from God, and who exactly gets to have one? Because for centuries, the underlying assumption was that this was a hyper-exclusive club. Literally, only a select few were tapped on the shoulder to speak for the divine. But to understand how that changes over time, we first need to understand what those ancient, highly exclusive callings actually look like in practice.
When we look at ancient history, specifically through the lens of biblical scholars like Dr. Robert Vanoy, we see a sharp distinction that completely challenges our modern assumptions. Usually, when we hear the word prophet, we instantly think of fortune tellers, right? People predicting the future. But academic analysis shows biblical prophecy was actually fundamentally about forthtelling God's ethical message rather than just foretelling future events. Prediction just wasn't the main essence of the job. Speaking out on behalf of God and delivering a direct, heavy moral message to the present generation, that was the actual core of the calling.
The ancient Israelites actually had a really brilliant taxonomy to describe this. On one hand, you've got the Nabi, which translates roughly to the proclaimer. This person's orientation is entirely outward. They are turned toward the people to loudly broadcast God's message. Then, on the other hand, you have the Ro, or the Hosea, the seer or gazer. Their focus is completely inward and upward, emphasizing the visionary reception of that message. So while these terms were often mixed and matched in everyday practice, they perfectly capture the dual nature of this ancient calling. First, receiving a profound vision, and second, loudly proclaiming it to the world.
Now you might be wondering, didn't other ancient cultures have prophets too? Yes, and what's really fascinating is the contrast between Israelite prophets and their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. If you look at the ecstatics or diviners of ancient Mesopotamia, like the Mahu and Baru detailed in the ancient Mari texts, you might easily assume they were doing the exact same thing as the biblical prophets. But the source text reveals some absolutely crucial, defining differences in how their callings operated in the real world.
Unlike Mesopotamian messages, which were very often delivered indirectly through third-party bureaucrats and heavily qualified with very polite phrases like, "Let my Lord do what pleases him," the biblical prophets were completely different. They didn't sugarcoat anything. They delivered direct, completely unqualified pronouncements right to the face of the ruling kings. And most importantly, rather than focusing on cultic rituals or animal sacrifices, they focused entirely on the heavy moral and spiritual condition of the nation. It was a calling that carried absolute, uncompromising authority.
All right, let's fast forward to the New Testament and see how this shifts from being an incredibly exclusive prophetic role, held by just a tiny handful of unique individuals, into a massive, unprecedented expansion. We are looking at a total paradigm shift here. The calling is no longer just for the isolated seer up on the mountain. Suddenly, it's distributed as spiritual gifts for all believers. It's an idea that is meticulously laid out in Paul's writings to the Corinthians.
Paul's writings actually deconstruct these graces into three really clean, distinct steps, which are beautifully mapped right onto the Trinity. First, you have gifts which flow from the Holy Spirit. These are granted by favor simply for the common good. Second, you have administrations, or specific ministries which are directed by the Son, answering the practical where, when, and to whom questions. And third, you have operations, or specific callings, which are energized directly by the Father. You can think of these operations as the actual doing, the tangible impact out in the world that causes a desired effect. To explain how all these different administrations work together, Paul uses this brilliant, timeless analogy of a human body. He argues that every single part, whether it's a foot, an eye, or a hand, has absolute equal value, a specific location, and a vital function. The eye can't just look at the hand and say, "Hey, I don't need you." This concept completely shatters the ancient hierarchy we were just talking about. It means the everyday person's specific function in their community is suddenly granted the exact same foundational value as the grand prophet of the past. But there is a really fascinating nuance that emerges in the text here. While every believer has a spiritual gift that's meant for the common good, certain appointed individuals actually are the gift themselves. Think about that distinction for a second. An apostle, a prophet, or a teacher doesn't just hold a particular skill, their very presence is the operation given by God to equip the rest of the church. They are literally the energy placed inside the body to stir up everyone else to action. Over the subsequent centuries, however, as we know, human nature has a way of complicating things. This highly distributed, deeply democratic view of ministry, where every single part of the body is seen as vital, often contracted back into a rigid institutional divide. Slowly, the church inadvertently separated the ordained clergy, who officially held the divine calling and the authority, from the everyday laity, the people sitting in the pews who seemingly did not. Essentially, we drifted right back toward that ancient model of the exclusive few.
Which brings us to a monumental shift in 20th century theology. There is a fantastic doctoral thesis by Paul Gerard Fleming that analyzes how the Second Vatican Council sought to bridge that massive gap. Specifically, it looks at a dogmatic constitution called Lumen Gentium and how it systematically worked to historically and academically tear down that wall between the clergy and the laity that had been built up over centuries.
Vatican II officially emphasized this revolutionary, yet fundamentally ancient concept, the common priesthood of the faithful. Basically, this is the theological concept that all believers share in the priesthood of Christ. It's distinct from, but totally complementary to, the ordained ministerial priesthood. It intentionally moves the church away from a strictly hierarchical top-down institution, and it reclaims that first-century concept that the entire assembly, every single person, is part of the people of God. The ordained ministry absolutely still exists, but it's complementary to the fact that every believer holds a valid, active calling. So, when we trace this entire historical timeline, we see an absolutely sweeping democratization of the divine calling. We started way back in antiquity with the intense individual intimacy of Jeremiah, who was known before the womb. We saw the rise of the institutional absolute prophets in the ancient Near East. Then, we watched the radical shift in the first century with universal gifts given to the entire body. And finally, we arrive at the 20th century's theological reclaiming of the common priesthood. The calling is no longer just for the elite. It's been handed to everyone. Which leaves us with this final, profound framework for you to consider today. If the historical and theological evidence suggests that you are uniquely known before birth, that you are gifted by the Spirit, and that you are called to a specific operation just as much as an ancient prophet, what is your part to play in the body? If the divine calling really has been democratized, how will you use yours? Thanks for joining us on this explainer, and we'll see you next time.